Madam President.
The senator from Vermont.
I want to thank Senator Kaine for his outstanding work on the committee and for his very cogent remarks. In the Republican budget, we don't have to talk about protecting absurd loopholes for large corporations and for the wealthiest people in this country. We don't have to talk about significant cuts in Head Start, making it harder for working families to send their kids to that very important program. We don't have to talk about cuts in the Pell Grant program, some $90 billion of mandatory funding, making it harder for working families to send their kids to college. We don't have to talk about raising taxes on working families by allowing the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Children's Tax Credit to expire. We don't even have to talk about that. All we have to do is to hear what Senator Kaine just said. Does anybody in America think it makes sense to tell 16 million men, women, and children who today have health insurance, some for the first time in their lives, that they're going to lose that health insurance? But, by the way, we'll continue to collect the taxes from the Affordable Care Act. Does anyone take that proposal seriously? Throwing 16 million people off of health insurance, the equivalent of, what was it, the 15 smallest states in America, and having no plan with what to do with these people. So, on the surface, I think the Republican budget makes no sense at all, and has a very warped sense of priorities in terms of protecting the wealthiest people in this country, the largest corporations, but sticking it to the middle class and working families. Senator Kaine mentioned that one of the areas that we, in fact, are going to focus on is the need to create jobs. I think all of us who are not particularly partisan are aware of the fact that the economy today is a lot better than it was when President Bush left office and we were hemorrhaging 800,000 jobs a month. Is the economy where we would like it to be today? I don't think anyone believes that. But have we made some significant progress in the last six and a half years? Yeah, I think we have. But having said that, let's be clear. If you look at the unemployment rates, unemployment in this country is not 5.5%. Real unemployment is close to 11%. Youth unemployment, that we never talk about at all, is somewhere around 17%. And African-American youth unemployment is off the charts. In addition to that, we have another major problem, and that is our infrastructure is crumbling. So what many of us think we should be doing is that at a time when our roads and bridges and rail system and water plants and wastewater plants and levees and dams and airports need a huge amount of work, and at a time when real unemployment is much higher than it should be, well, what about a pretty common sense approach which says, let's start rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure and let us put Americans back to work? And you know what? That is what the American people want. On every poll that I have seen, the top priority of the American people, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, is the economy, create jobs, raise wages, and that is what we should be doing. So, Madam President, in about an hour or so, I will officially offer an amendment which will, in fact, rebuild our crumbling infrastructure and create many, many millions of decent-paying jobs. Now, in terms of infrastructure, which is a fancy word for roads and bridges and water systems and rail and so forth, I don't think you have to be a PhD in infrastructure to know that our infrastructure is really in quite bad shape. Every day somebody gets into a car, whether it's in Vermont or in Washington, D.C., and you see that pothole that takes away half of your axle, you know, that's what infrastructure is about. And when you're in a traffic jam because the road is inadequate to deal with traffic, that's called infrastructure. When your water pipes in your town are bursting and flooding downtown. That's called infrastructure. Now, the truth is that for too many years, Congress has dramatically underfunded the maintenance and improvement of the physical infrastructure that our economy depends upon. That has got to change, and that is why I will be introducing an amendment to invest $478 billion over 6 years to modernize our infrastructure. And how will we pay for that? Will we pay for it by throwing children off of Head Start? Will we pay for it by throwing people off the Affordable Care Act? No. We're going to pay for it in the right way, and that is to close tax loopholes that allow corporations and billionaires to shift their profits to the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and other tax havens. So instead of having these corporations putting their money in tax havens, paying zero in federal income tax, and at a time when we're losing about $100 billion a year for that reason, we're going to ask these corporations to start paying their fair share of taxes, and then we're going to use that money to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure and put millions of people back to work. This amendment, and by the way, I would tell you personally, I have introduced legislation that is more expansive than this, but because I want all of the members of the Senate to be supporting this, I have tailored it down a little bit, and we are talking about $478 billion over 6 years. This amendment will support more than 9 million good-paying jobs over 6 years, more than 1.5 million jobs a year. And this is money that not only creates jobs and rebuilds our infrastructure, it makes the country more productive, more efficient, and safer. Right now, Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, makes the point that if we take into account the impact of depreciation, our net investment in infrastructure is actually closer to zero of GDP, 0%. In other words, what we're spending our money is not building new infrastructure, but replacing and patching up old infrastructure. The sad truth is that as a nation, we are falling further and further behind. Throughout China, multi-billion-dollar projects are underway to build new bridges, airports, tunnels, an $80 billion water project, and high-speed rail lines. In China, not in the United States. This past November, China approved nearly $115 billion for 21 additional major infrastructure projects. While we are debating, while we refuse to invest in our crumbling infrastructure, China is doing just that in spades. Madam President, it is no surprise that the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report now ranks our overall infrastructure at 12th in the world. 12th in the world. That's down from 7th place a decade ago, and there was once a time when the United States had an infrastructure that was the envy of the world. Now we are in 12th place. Let's take a look at some of the problems that we face and why we need to invest in infrastructure. 1 out of every 9 bridges in this country is structurally deficient, and nearly a quarter are functionally obsolete. We need to rebuild crumbling bridges. Almost 1/3 of our roads are in poor or mediocre condition, and more than 42% of all urban highways are congested. We need to rebuild crumbling roads. Transit systems across the country are struggling to address deferred maintenance even as ridership steadily increases. People want to take advantage of transit, get to work in transit, and yet the transit authorities are deferring maintenance because of limited funds. Meanwhile, 45% of American households lack any meaningful access to transit, which is a huge problem in rural areas across the country, including the state of Vermont. In Vermont, in most cases, you have one way to get to work and only one way, and that is in your automobile. The amendment that I will be offering also creates a national infrastructure bank. This idea, championed in the past by senators on both sides of the aisle, will leverage private capital to finance more than $250 billion in transportation, energy, environmental, and telecommunications projects. My amendment will also greatly expand credit assistance to projects of national and regional significance through the TIFIA program, long championed by my good friend from California, Senator Barbara Boxer. And it will boost funding for the highly competitive TIGER program that funds locally sponsored transportation projects across the country that increase economic competitiveness and promote innovation. But we all know that our infrastructure problems are not just limited to roads, bridges, and transit. Much of our nation's rail system is obsolete, even though our energy-efficient railroads move more freight than ever, and Amtrak's ridership has never been higher. While we debate the merits of high-speed rail here in Congress, countries across Europe and Asia have gone ahead and built vast high-speed rail networks. And guess what? They work. High-speed rail trains relieve congestion on roads and airports and whisk people around quickly and efficiently. China has already 12,000 miles of track with trains that run at least 125 miles per hour and several thousand miles with trains that can travel at 200 miles per hour. Meanwhile, the Acela, Amtrak's fastest train, travels at an average speed of just 65 miles per hour. This amendment will invest $12 billion to make much-needed investments to upgrade our passenger and freight rail lines, to move people and goods more quickly and efficiently. It is time for America to catch up with the rest of the world. There was once a time we were number one in infrastructure. Today we are number 12. I hear my friends on the other side talking about the debt we're going to be leaving our kids and our grandchildren. Well, we are going to leave them a crumbling infrastructure, which at some point somebody is going to have to pay for unless we get our act together right now. Madam President, America's airports are bursting at the seams as the numbers of passengers and cargo grow. The North America Airports Council says that airports need almost $76 billion over the next 5 years to accommodate growth in passengers and cargo activity and to rehabilitate existing facilities. Moreover, and rather incredibly, our airports still rely on antiquated 1960s radar technology because Congress chronically underfunds deployment of a new satellite-based air traffic control system. This amendment will invest $6 billion to improve airports across the country. It will invest another $6 billion to bring our air traffic control system into the 21st century by accelerating deployment of next-gen technology that will make our skies safer and our airports more efficient. And anyone, as many of us do, who flies a whole lot, knows that our airports need to be more efficient than they are. Bottlenecks at our marine seaports, which handle 95% of all overseas imports and exports, cause delays that prevent goods from getting to their destinations on time. The same is true, perhaps even more so, for our inland waterways, which carry the equivalent of 50 million truck trips of goods every year. My amendment will invest an additional $1 billion a year to clear the backlog of projects needed to improve inland waterways, coastal harbors, and shipping channels. Our businesses simply can't compete in the global economy if they can't move their goods and supplies to, from, and within our country more efficiently. Right now, more than 4,000 of the nation's 84,000 dams are considered deficient. 84,000 dams considered deficient. Not in need of a few repairs, but deficient. Serious problems. Even worse, one of every 11 levees has been rated as likely to fail during a major flood. I'll talk a little more about this issue in a few minutes, as this is something that should concern everyone in the Senate. My amendment will invest $5 billion a year to repair and improve the high-hazard dams that provide flood control, drinking water, irrigation, hydropower, and recreation across the country. and the flood levees that protect our cities and our farms. Much of our drinking water infrastructure is nearing the end of its useful life. And I like to tell the story that in Rutland, Vermont, a few years ago, that city, one of the largest in Vermont, had water pipes that were built before the Civil War. And I think that that is not all that uncommon. Cities and towns all over this country, in many instances, have pipes that go way, way, way back and are constantly breaking and causing serious leaks. Each year, there are nearly 250,000 water main breaks, with a loss of 7 billion gallons of fresh water. Let me repeat that. Each year, there are nearly 250,000 water main breaks, with a loss of 7 billion gallons of fresh water. But that's nothing compared to the amount of water we lose through leaky pipes and faulty meters. In all, the American Water Works Association estimates that we lose 2.1 trillion gallons of treated drinking water every year. 2.1 trillion gallons. Clearly, this is an issue that cannot continue to be delayed. We have got to address that. Our wastewater treatment plants aren't in much better shape than our freshwater pipes are. Almost 10 billion gallons of raw sewage are dumped into our nation's waterways every year when plants fail or pipes burst, often during heavy rains. My amendment would invest $2 billion a year so states can improve the drinking water systems that provide Americans with clean, safe water. It would similarly invest $2 billion a year to improve the wastewater and stormwater infrastructure that protect water quality in our nation's rivers and lakes. Madam President, America's aging electrical grid consists of a patchwork system of interconnected power generation, transmission, and distribution facilities, some of which date back to the early 1900s. Not surprisingly, the grid suffers from hundreds of major power failures every year, many of which are avoidable. Our grid system simply is not up to the 21st century challenges that it faces, including resiliency to cyber attacks. It is no wonder the World Economic Forum ranks our electric grid at just 24th in the world in terms of reliability, just behind Barbados. My amendment will invest $3 billion a year for power transmission and distribution modernization projects to improve the reliability and resiliency of our ever more complex electric power grid. This investment will also position our grid to accept new sources of locally generated renewable energy and will address critical vulnerabilities to cyber attacks, an issue of great concern to many of us. Another area where we are falling behind is Internet access and speed. And this is especially important to rural states like Vermont. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, ranks the United States 16th in the world in terms of broadband access. 16th in the world in terms of broadband access. Not something that we should be terribly proud of. We are only marginally better in terms of average broadband speed, 12th in the world, according to Acame's 2014 annual report. How can it be that businesses, schools, and families in Bucharest, Romania, have access to much faster Internet than most of the United States of America? My amendment will invest $2 billion a year to expand high-speed broadband networks in underserved and unserved areas and to boost speeds and capacity all across this country. Let's be clear. Internet access is no longer a luxury. It is essential for 21st century commerce, for education, for telemedicine, and for public safety. We cannot continue to lag behind many of our global competitors in terms of broadband quality and access. Madam President, that is a brief summary of what my amendment does. It addresses a chronic funding shortfall. It addresses the need to start the kinds of investments we need to bring our infrastructure, our physical infrastructure, into the 21st century. If $478 billion over 6 years sounds like a lot of money, please consider this. The American Society of Civil Engineers, the people who actually know the most about the state of America's infrastructure, they say we need to invest $3.6 trillion by 2020 just to get our nation's infrastructure to a state of good repairs. So this amendment is a good start, but that's all it is. It is a good start. Much more has to be done. And let me just conclude by asking my fellow Americans to imagine an America where millions of people in our 50 states are hard at work earning good wages, rebuilding our crumbling bridges, making our roads much better, dealing with wastewater plants, dealing with water systems, dealing with our rail system. Think about what America looks like when we create an infrastructure that is 21st century. So, Madam President, our job right now is to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. And as a former mayor, I can absolutely assure you, infrastructure does not get better all by itself. You can't turn around and ignore it and think it gets better. Quite the contrary, it gets worse. If you have a bridge right now which is in serious disrepair, it does not get better by ignoring it. It only gets worse, and in fact, it ends up costing more money to rebuild it as it deteriorates. So we have an opportunity right now. We have an opportunity to make our country more efficient, more productive, and safer by creating a 21st century infrastructure, and at the same time, we have an opportunity to create millions of decent-paying jobs. In many respects, this is a no-brainer. And this amendment is paid for by ending outrageous corporate loopholes that allowed large, profitable corporations from paying any federal income tax. So, Madam President, I hope that we will have wide bipartisan support for this amendment, which, as I understand it, will be voted on tomorrow, and I will officially bring it up in about a half hour. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk would call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.